Hey up, right, I've changed the rear shocks of the Royal Enfield Classic 350 REborn, and I'm going to go into that in a moment, why I changed them and why I'm really pleased that I changed them. Not so much a fitting video, although I will go over one or two points that people need to watch out for when they're swapping the springs on this particular model of bike, which I think will probably apply to the Hunter and the Meteor 350 as well. Now, last week and over the weekend, I must have received 50 or 60 comments asking me what my opinion is of the new 2025 Royal Enfield Classic 500, which had me scratching my head a bit, really, because last year Royal Enfield made it, I think, reasonably clear that they were not going to be introducing a single cylinder 500. They've just released the 650 twin, and I've certainly not received any press releases stating that they've released a Classic 500 single. We've not seen any spy shots, which usually anything from 6 months to 18 months before a model is released, some spy shots escape from India and they do the rounds. Now, if I just received one or two comments about this subject, I would probably have just ignored it, but there were so many I thought I need to look into this, otherwise I'm going to miss the boat on something rather spectacular. I did a lot of research on Google. I couldn't find anything about it apart from a few videos that have appeared here on YouTube. And having watched a few of those videos, I think I know what's happened. And I'm sorry to say to those people that contacted me about this new model, you've been victims of a hoax. It's a sad fact here on YouTube that there are certain people who believe they can make a lot of money from a YouTube channel, but, you know, they don't have the talent, the knowledge, or the motorcycles to be able to make that happen. So what they do is they just copy footage from launches, etc. They use a text-to-speech facility on their editors, and they make bogus videos that they think will get a lot of views. And of course, announcing something like a new Classic 500 is potentially going to get a lot of views. Now, admittedly, some of these videos do look quite professional, but that's because they've copied professional footage, and the voiceover also sounds very professional because they're using an AI text-to-speech app on their editors, which gives a very polished narrative performance. In fact, if you closed your eyes while listening to one of them, it sounded just like James Earl Jones. It all looks and sounds very good, but when you look closely at the footage, I mean, the editing's not up to much because they're just generally showing some pictures and, running, as I say, what is basically stolen footage. Quite often, you're looking at completely the wrong bike to what they're talking about. There was one that I looked at that it was clearly a 350, one of the launches of the 350 2 or 3 years ago, but telling you that it's a new Classic 500. It's all completely bogus as far as I can tell. These particular videos are being sort of published by what appears to be 2 or 3 different channels. I suspect they're all the same person in reality. It's all just intended to get as many clicks as possible. I can see how some people have fallen for it, but as I say, if you study the footage, look at the bikes properly and listen to what the fake voice is saying, it's quite clear that they're just using old footage from 2 or 3 years ago, different bike launches, in the hope of making some easy money. I wish it was as easy as that. But as far as I'm concerned, certainly for the moment, there's no announcements being made by Royal Enfield. This is disinformation. Right, so new shocks on the Classic 350. Now, if you remember last year, I made a video about pillion work on the Classic 350, and I was actually pretty impressed by the rear shocks on this bike. I mean, most manufacturers, rear shocks seem to be an afterthought, and you're pretty soon thinking about having to change them. I didn't have those reservations about the 350, they're well up to the job, but I did discover an issue. And that is the issue of preload adjustability. Now, I remember when I got the Classic 500, that had this weird sort of upside down piggyback rear shock absorber affair, and the crazy thing about it was they'd placed the preload adjuster right next to the piggyback reservoir, which meant you couldn't actually turn the collar with a tool. In fact, there was no C-spanner with the toolkit on my Classic 500 because it was impossible to adjust it. The piggyback reservoir actually stopped you from turning a normal C-spanner. To adjust it, you couldn't adjust it, which, if you remember, was the main reason that I changed the rear shock for Hagon's on that bike, and I've never looked back since. So I was quite relieved when I got the Classic 350 to see it had a fairly standard setup with a castellated adjustment ring at the bottom. The only problem is the metal on it is literally about 2mm thick. And then to make matters worse, the C-spanner is just stamped out of sheet metal like most C-spanners. So one side of it is rounded, whereas the other side is quite sharp. But that rounded edge means you've got even less meat to grab onto the adjustment collar with. No matter how careful you are, it just keeps slipping off. Now, when I first got the 350, I had a few people complain about this. I had a look at it and it hadn't quite clicked with me what the problem was. I thought it was just them, but it's not them, it's the shock absorber. Adjusting the preload is a frustrating knuckle skinning experience. Not impossible, but it becomes one of those tasks that you try your best to avoid. Now, add to that the Royal Enfield luggage rack, and that puts some other barriers in your way. It makes it even more inaccessible. And I've got to admit, when I first adjusted the 350 to take Paula on the back to do the pillion test work last year, it took me half an hour to adjust the preload by 1 point on either side. I remember I got one side up 3 places, which is where I thought it needed to be. That was the right hand side, but the left hand side, because of that sort of chamfer on the C-spanner, I couldn't get it adjusted any further than 2, so I had to drop the right hand side down to 2 and left it there because I just didn't have any time left. I'd already spent half an hour on it. Now, as a result of this, even when riding solo, I've just left the suspension set up for pillion work because it's just such a huge task adjusting the suspension. Now, I suppose I could take the racks off each time, but that's going to take me half an hour to do, and then I've got to put them back on again. It's just not worth the hassle, so for an easier life, I had to look for an alternative. Now, if you remember, a month or so back, I fitted the Hagon 2820 full shroud rear shock absorber setup on the BSA Gold Star. Really impressed with these shocks. Now, I would describe these shock absorbers as a commuter stroke long distance touring shock. They're not a budget shock, but nor are they a hyper expensive track shock. They're designed to give excellent handling and road holding while still giving a good degree of comfort to passenger and solo rider, whilst giving you the visual appeal and practicality of a full shrouded shock, which gives you a more authentic look for any modern classic based on a 1950s or 1960s machine. Now, in conversations with Dan at Hitchcock's Motorcycles, I discussed this issue of adjustability on the Classic 350 a few times, and he noted to me that a lot of customers complain about it. And in the last conversation, he said to me, well, why don't you just fit a shrouded 2820 to the Classic 350? Problem solved. You have a new shock which is far better in performance than the original shock, and the design allows for much easier adjustment. Plus, you've got adjustment for rebound and compression damping for the 2820, whereas you have no damping control whatsoever on the OEM shocks. So that's exactly what I've done, and if I'm honest, I feel a bit stupid for not doing it earlier. I've had this bike for almost 3 years. Although, in my defence, I didn't really appreciate the issue until last year when I started taking a pillion. Now, because the adjustment collar sits higher up than on the original shocks, it's out of the way of most of the bracketry that does actually foul adjustment with the original shock. It's still not really easy, you are limited for space, but even with the standard sort of long throw C-spanner that comes with the Hagon shock, you can still adjust both sides in about 30 seconds, no problem. You just have to be a little bit careful about placement. These shocks are designed to take all the guesswork out of it for the owner. You've got 3 simple preload adjustments. Number 1 is for solo rider, 2 is for solo rider with pillion, and 3 is for solo rider with pillion and luggage if you require a little bit extra support. And that's all there is to it. If you just stick to those instructions, you can't go wrong. It also has damping control, which is situated at the top of the shock body of both of the shocks. Now this is a combined compression and rebound damping control. You've got approximately 7 turns to the left, which softens dampening, and 7 turns to the right from the central point, which stiffens dampening up. Now, changes to the damping along the full range is subtle, but it is very effective. Now, I'm not going to go through a full fitting video for these shocks because, you know, I've made those videos so many times on this channel. There's just a few things to be aware of. The chain guard snags the removal of the low mounting for the shock absorber. You can't get it out, basically. So you just need to undo that screw and tuck the plastic chain guard behind the swing arm in order to be able to remove the lower mount of the shock absorber. Just don't forget to replace it and tighten everything back up when you've completed the installation. And obviously that comes into play when you're fitting and removing the left hand side shock absorber. The right hand side, what you have to be aware of, and this comes down to the type of bracketry that Royal Enfield use for fitting their shock absorbers. I'll be honest, I don't like it. Directly underneath you've got 2 wires. Well, actually you've got a hose for your brake and you've got the control wire for the ABS that run underneath the shock absorber itself. Whilst removing or installing a shock absorber, there is a danger of damaging those wires, so be very wary of them when you're performing this installation. There is a potential for nipping the ABS sensor wire when you actually fasten the the main bolt for the shock absorber. Also, as with all shock absorber fitments, you sometimes find there's a little bit of levering required to get the holes to line up. Sometimes you'll have to use something like a flat bladed screwdriver protected with a rag to sort of lever the shock upwards to line the hole up. Obviously, with those lines in the way, there's a big potential for damaging them, so think about it, do it carefully to make sure that you don't cause any damage while you're doing that. Now, the other issue that I came across, and this is a Royal Enfield thing, the type of mounting system that they use is a sort of a claw that the actual shock absorber itself is sandwiched between, and then you push a bolt through. In my opinion, Royal Enfield don't use a heavy enough gauge steel for this. It's very flexible. I personally think they need to be using a heavier gauge steel than they are, because I've seen this on several bikes over the years. What happens is, even under relatively low torque settings for the actual mounting bolt itself, the whole bracket bends inwards and pinches the actual shock absorber itself. As you see here, it's the fact that those 2 jaws are basically bent in when it's been fastened on at the factory, and it's clamping on the top of the actual shock absorber itself. I had the devil's job getting this one out. And again, this is a common complaint that I hear from people, especially with the new 350 models. They seem to be worse than you know, all the previous models and the other 650s, etc. Now on the left hand side, I was able to release this by just gently prising the jaws open with a screwdriver, you know, to release the pressure on it. On this one on the right hand side, I ended up having to sort of drift it out with a tool and a hammer. I mean, okay, not everybody wants to change the shock absorbers, but some do, and I know that this has been an issue for quite a few people. Royal Enfield, you need to address this and use a thicker gauge steel to stop this from happening. I'm not entirely sure why they've gone for such thin steel on what is a critical component. Maybe down to weight saving, more likely down to saving a few pennies on material, but it needs to be stronger than it is. And that's it really, it's just those three little issues to watch out for when you're fitting it. Other than that, it's pretty straightforward, 20, maybe 30 minutes for both sides. Now, even if you don't have adjustment issues with the OEM shocks on your particular bike, I believe it's still well worth swapping over to these shrouded 2820 shock absorbers. For a start, the look far better than the OEM shocks. You've got that damping adjustability that you don't have with the OEM shocks, and you've got far better quality springs. They do feel a little bit tauter than the original springs, although that might be because the original springs on my bike have got like 2,500–3,000 miles on them now. They provide much better control to the back wheel. They certainly have improved or just slightly sharpened up the handling on my Classic 350, and they are uber comfortable with bags of adjustability to dial it in exactly how you want it. Also, the paintwork on these exactly matches the front shroud on the front forks and the other black painted detailing on the bike. These are perfect for commuting and are especially good for touring with or without pillion and luggage. As I say, that is primarily what these inverted 2820s were designed for. They're a practical, comfortable workhorse, not a track shock. As usual, I will leave a link to Hitchcock's website for these shocks if you'd like to have a look at them. I believe they do have a non-shrouded or partially shrouded version of these if you prefer the exposed spring look. Once again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. I really do appreciate it. I'd also appreciate it if you would leave a like and consider subscribing to this channel if you're not already a subscriber. You can help me out in other ways via my Patreon page or PayPal donations or via the super thanks button down below. Not essential, but much appreciated. I would of course be back on Friday, so until then, please ride safely, and I'll see you soon.